so much for joining me today, Carson. Did you want to start off the interview just by introducing yourself, tell people about what you do and your career at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a writer, a speaker, and a coach, and I'm a disability justice advocate. So I spend my time in all of those different areas. I speak and I coach about powerful living, as well as disability justice advocacy. So
Yep.
those are kind of the topics that I spend most of my time on.
Cool.
Um, yeah, that's what I'm doing right now with my life.
And I guess like what got you into it and what makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, so when I became injured, so I broke my neck and the spinal cord and with injured spinal cord in 2013, obviously became disabled as a result. And just started realizing how much the world didn't work for disabled people and started becoming very interested in making a difference and raising awareness and having conversations about ableism and accessibility, all those things, right? So that
Yeah.
was kind of the birthplace of the advocacy naturally. But I also became very interested in how to have a life that I loved, as a person who lives in such an ableist society,
Hmm.
right? So I became interested in knowing how to become empowered in any circumstance, how to be fulfilled, how to just basically have what I want and
Yeah.
uh, be like a powerful human being. So I went on a journey of discovery and a lot of transformational education kind of stuff, and then became a coach and a speaker around that. So but it all comes back to, that I acquired the disability and that really changed my life.
Yeah. Which, it does. So obviously similar situation for myself. Yeah, and it does. I think people sometimes try to create this narrative that it doesn't change your life.
Right.
But for me, I think the biggest changes have actually been that it's just opened my eyes to how the world works and the structures of privilege and marginalization that occur. And before I was totally ignorant to all of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, and once you learn about that stuff, it's hard not to be involved and for most of your work to stem from that. So yeah,
Totally.
yeah,
And I think for me, it was a realization that I would say like 90% of my suffering was unnecessary. It was stuff that could be solved by
yeah,
addressing ableism, by addressing attitudes, by addressing systemic inaccessibility, all of that stuff.
yeah,
And that's why I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why don't we invest in people not having to suffer the way that I've suffered in the system?
exactly. Yeah, and like, because I mean, again, and I think this can come across quite inspo porny sometimes, and I hope people don't take it this way, but it is that whole idea that a whole element of our suffering was tied into mental health, which a lot of the time was tied into feelings of, unworthiness post accident or
Totally.
post injury, and that all stems from the idea that people with disability are less than or unworthy, and that comes from ableism and our systemic structures. So yeah, instead of, because I have talked about this before, and I think sometimes it can come across in Spoponia because I'm like, I don't want anyone to go through the same sufferings that I've gone through. And people are like, yeah. And I'm like, no, I don't think you're understanding. What I'm saying is like, we all need to work to dismantle this system because if we did that, yeah, it'd still be shit to acquire a spinal cord injury in different ways, but
Yeah.
you wouldn't have to go through like 90% of the shit where it's like,
Yeah.
am I gonna like have sex or be loved ever again? Am I gonna get a job ever again? So it's dismantling all of that shit.
Yes. And it's
Yeah.
so important to be able to distinguish between those two experiences
Mm.
because people who don't see ableism because they don't know what it is, they haven't distinguished it yet, think that it's all one thing, right?
Yeah.
They think that the worthlessness, like, naturally would come from having a disability, right? They don't see that, like, it's all made up, it's a construction, it's added meaning
Yep.
that's really not there, right? The only thing that's inherently tricky about a spinal cord injury for me is that I just have to like figure out how to get around,
Mm.
which can all be solved by, for the most part, can be solved by altering my environment.
Mm.
But like you said, the amount of time that I spend being sad about not walking is like very little compared to the amount of frustration that I face by an environment that's not set up well for me, or by attitudes that clearly devalue my life because of, you know, the disability and that identity. But it's not really because of the inherent experience of being disabled. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
does.
Right.
Absolutely. So one of the big problems I recognize for people with disability at the moment is the systemic desexualization of people with disability. Do you want to explain a bit about this for people who might not know what it is, and also why you think it actually happens?
Yeah. So I have a few hypotheses about why disabled people are desexualized. Um, but yeah, so the systemic desexualization of disabled people is what it sounds like. It's just interacting with disabled people as though they are not sexual creatures, that they either can't have sex or don't want to have sex.
Mm.
It's also attitudes about sexiness, right? What is appealing, what is attractive, what is mainstream in terms of like a sexy body. And so disabled people obviously have bodies that are not considered by our current norms to be able and normal, right? And
Mm.
so all of the porn that we have, all of the sexual um, you know, interactions that we see in film and media and all of that generally represent just able-bodied people
Yeah.
having able-bodied sex in a really stereotypical way, which just leaves out people who have marginalized bodies or whose bodies are disabled, right?
Yeah.
So it makes it difficult for people to conceptualize that no, disabled people can have sex. Disabled people have a lot of varying sexual function, right? Um, but that they can experience pleasure and they want orgasm, they want like romantic sexual relationships, they want all of that for the most part, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing about a disability that makes you desexualized or asexual.
No.
Um, so that is kind of where I think it comes from, and it's a real tough part of the disability experience. I mean, what would you say in terms of your experience?
I think my experiences, like everyone, have been like I've got lots of positive experiences and lots of negative experiences as well. I definitely agree about like the representation because I mean we're totally underrepresented everywhere, like in every industry, and that it's this vicious cycle that's lots of different things are contributing. There's things around like employment and education, so that all feeds into whether we are represented or not, because
Right.
we're not then employed in like creative roles that might require, that secondary education or that tertiary education.
Mm,
And so if we're not in those creative roles, we can't control our own narratives, and then we don't get those genuine forms of representation. So definitely very important. But I think sometimes also the medical model of disability plays into it quite a lot as well, where people just see us as subhuman or humans with, deficits. And so they think like, oh, well, they can't do this. And they just immediately jump to like, well, they can't do this. Like, if they're paralyzed from the waist down, then like sex just isn't for them, sort of
yeah.
thing. So I think that definitely weighs into it a whole lot. So a big thing that I would probably ask anyone who watches this is to research the social model of disability,
Yeah.
and just start reframing your own mindset around the world and around disability, because the social model is basically based on this concept of like, we're not subhuman, we are still human, and we just have different requirements that society hasn't set out or catered to before. And if you do cater to those, then we can
Yeah.
participate. So
Yeah.
I think that's very important to consider as well. But yeah, I would love to see like one of my most recent, probably favorite TV shows that came out was Euphoria
Uh-huh.
on with Zendaya. It was fucking amazing. But like disability representation would have been so good for teens in that,
Yeah.
because they would have felt so represented, and that was all about like discovering sexuality, discovering like gender identity,
Yeah.
And then just like in terms of sexuality, like actually starting to have sex with people and stuff as well, because obviously we know that people do that around, the older end of teenage. So like, yeah, it's just so important, I think, for this next generation. If they can see that representation, it'll be so much better than us at being inclusive.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that representation, like you said, having actual disabled people in the roles that they're
Yeah,
playing, hiring disabled actors, and then also like increasing, so like that's in like film and television, right? And then in social media though, it's like we need more momentum and representation and visibility as a movement, because
yeah,
so many people do spend time on Instagram or these other visual platforms where they could start to be exposed to stories, and it's a different kind of representation, but I think it's quite accessible, and it's also something that we as disabled people can kind of control ourselves, right?
yeah,
Like how we show up and trying to like build more visibility amongst ourselves in the movement.
definitely. And so many people ask me, like, where can I learn about this stuff? And I'm like, everywhere. You just have to look for it.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like I can suggest you like 3 different accounts of people with disability, and we're all pretty fucking awesome at like sharing to our own stories, other people's stuff as well. So you'll most
yeah,
likely, if you follow like 3 of us, you'll end up following 30 of us because,
totally. Yeah,
and yeah, it's that whole concept of like people have no idea how many of us there are. Like there's around 20% of the population, like 15 to 20% in most countries, are people with disability, and people would have no idea about
yeah,
that. So
yeah.
yeah, very important stuff.
So important.
Cool. All right, third question. So we both acquired impairments, which means we weren't disabled from birth. Do you think your sex life has changed since becoming disabled?
Yes, but I have a weird story, I think, because
Weird stories
I
are the best.
what's that?
Weird stories are the best.
Okay, so I came out the same time that I became disabled, and so I grew up like a deeply conservative Mormon, and so as I was kind of exploring my sexuality, just like right as I was exploring it is when I became injured. So
Mm,
I was 23 years old and never had sex previous to my injury. So I actually don't have a baseline as an able-bodied person to be like, this is how my sex life changed, or this is how people respond to me differently,
yeah.
because I did have a year of dating and being on the apps, and I did have a baseline there,
Yep.
right? In terms of how people treated me as an able-bodied man. But in terms of my actual sex life, what changed is that I actually started experimenting with sex where I hadn't been before. That had nothing to do with my
Yeah.
injury, right? Um,
How interesting. So maybe I should rephrase the question around, your sex life and possibly your relationships.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it was different. It was dramatically different because my immediate assumption was that no one will want me.
Yeah.
And that was all that internalized ableism. That was just like, I'm gross now. Like, and I told my mom this. Oh my gosh. And it broke her heart. I said, like, Mom, no one's Prince Charming is in a wheelchair. That was like the statement because that's
And
where I was.
sorry to interject, like that's
Yeah.
what we fucking need. Like that's what we need. Like whether it starts with like some cartoon new Disney movie where there is a Prince Charming who is a wheelchair user, that's what we need so that you don't have
Yes.
that moment.
No, yes, exactly. Because I was like, no one's like me. No one is looking for someone like me. I'm a broken version of someone else's best self. And no one's going to want to date me. And so I really just didn't try for a while until I got angry. And then I was like, you know what? Like, I deserve this. I deserve relationships. I'm putting myself out there. I'm going to take risks. I'll fail. I'll be rejected. Whatever. I'm doing it though.
Yeah.
Um, and so then I put myself out there and just like navigated through people who were like, so can you even have sex, or does this work? Or people asking really invasive questions or just
Yeah.
assuming that things worked a particular way. um so there was just a massive barrier of self-worth that had to be
Yeah.
hurdled before I could even show up as like a worthy partner.
Yeah.
And even when I was dating guys, that got in the way a lot at the beginning, was just me feeling like I don't bring anything to this relationship, and I'm not equal, like I can't give equally, or I don't know. And it's all made up because I was fully participating. I was fully giving back. Like I was a very present, giving, thoughtful partner, but it
Yeah.
just, in my mind, it was like, but the wheelchair.
Yeah. It's like something that detracted, like it's almost like I was like, oh, they're like compromising or something. I was
Yeah,
similar when I
I don't.
first started
Yeah,
because I was just like, oh, well, and then I was like, oh, well, and I have to like overcompensate in other ways, like and be like
uh,
really super nice all the time. And it's like, no, you don't.
no, exactly. And I hear that all the time from disabled people. Actually,
Yeah.
is like they do extra favors, or they pay for extra things, or they compensate in their relationship in order to kind of like prove that they're an equal partner. But there
Yeah.
are a lot of ways to support your partner, and reaching something in the cupboard
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
one way, and being with someone and holding their emotions and empathizing with them is another. You know what I mean? It's
And like weighing up the two, the cupboard is probably a lot easier. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And
So,
it's that whole idea of like, because this is also explored a lot, and I think this is one of the really powerful things about social media is that this is explored a lot, is about the whole like caregiver idea in relationships with people with disability. So that's like this idea that, well, it's not even, I was going to say it's between like a non-disabled person and a person with disability, that the non-disabled person always takes this caring role, but it could be two people with disability as well.
sure.
But it's it's that notion that like someone must always be the caregiver when there is a person with disability in a relationship, which is, I would say, in some elements, sure, that is true for some specific things, like you're talking about, like reaching things like that are high. My whole thing with that as well, though, is that if the world was a lot more accessible or universal designed, it wouldn't fucking be necessary.
Yeah,
Like, if I
exactly.
could reach the top shelf at the supermarket, I wouldn't ask anyone to do that for me. It's
Yeah.
not generally that I want someone to do that for me. But then the other part of it is that, like, in every single relationship, the partners support each other, or everyone in the relationship should be generally supporting each other in some way, because I feel like that is what a relationship is. So,
Yes.
like, I'm kind of like, I don't understand this whole idea that it's like, oh, you must care for them and you're an angel, because it's like everybody cares for each other when they're in a relationship, don't they?
Yeah,
In some way.
absolutely. And I still think that there's this like arbitrary norm of this is the extent to which you can be supported by your partner, and if it's outside of that, this becomes caregiving,
Yeah.
right? Because that still goes back to this notion of like of ableism, that there's like a general set of abilities that everyone should have, and if you don't have those, something's wrong and you need to make up for it.
Yeah.
Like your need for reaching that thing in the cupboard is legitimate. Your need for someone to help you do whatever you need to do is legitimate, as much as, I'm trying to think of something like if my boyfriend like hurts his back or something, like I'll often like
Yeah.
like massage it out or do something. Like that's a legitimate need too, and it's fine, and we just like needs are needs, and we don't have to judge them and put them in a hierarchy of like what's too much or too little or needed to be compensated for. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah, it does. And it's just about like supporting each other. Like that's my whole thing. It's like relationships are just like about supporting each other in the ways
Yeah.
that you can support each other. So
Yeah.
people just overcomplicate it, I think.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. Like people undercomplicate things, but then I think they also overcomplicate things like that. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, last question. Yay. Why do you think it's so important for the sex toy industry to improve when it comes to inclusion, accessibility, and universal design?
Um, for oh gosh, so many reasons. I think that it's empowerment,
Yeah.
in terms of it enables people to participate and have access to their own bodies and the bodies of their sexual partners in a way that allows them to participate in their sexual identity.
Yeah.
So a sexual relationship requires a certain amount of function or ability between partners. to whatever extent, right?
Yeah.
But having toys and other technology that's accessible just makes that all smooth. It's just like building accessibility into any other piece of life, into public transportation, into school systems and whatever. The whole point is to allow people to participate in life in that area, right? So they can get where they're going, so they can meet their needs, so they can actually fulfill on their goals and dreams and hopes and be fully fledged human beings. So we need toys and technology in the area of sex so that people can fulfill themselves and do all of that in that area of life, obviously, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's like this misconception sometimes when I talk about this, that like some people I think start to believe that people with disability can't have sex without toys, and that's not true either. Or that we need the toys to enjoy, which that's not true either. Like it may be true for some people, but I know for me that's not necessarily true. But it's more about like, this is an industry that exists that is accessible and creates more opportunities for non-disabled people. If it's not accessible to us as people with disability, then it's exclusive, which just shouldn't happen. Like we should also have equal opportunity within that industry as well. So, and then I mean, on top of that, it creates like things like jobs, like employment opportunities for people with disability to like help design these things or create their own businesses around them. So, and there are a couple. Obviously, one of them is who we're speaking about today, which is XES Products. And they are doing some good stuff about actually getting other products that are already made and listing them on their websites, and then educating people about the different design features that are either deliberately in those pieces or in those toys, or incidentally in those toys, that actually make them more accessible or more like universal designed for people with disability to use, or just for all people to use, really. And also, I think they're coming up with a prototype soon of their own toy, which will be kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I guess probably to finish off, do you have anything else you wanted to share around sexuality, disability, relationships? Anything you feel like you wanted to get out there?
No, I think that just I was wanting to piggyback on what you said last about allowing people to like participate, not so that the industry was not just exclusive. Because while you were talking, I was thinking like sex toys actually make certain experiences accessible for able-bodied people too, that wouldn't be accessible without, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, obviously including disabled people in that has to happen. But
Definitely.
I thought it was a good point.
Include us
Anyway,
in everything. And then, yeah, I think it's just about being mindful and inclusive of us in everything, really. And looking at the way the world's been structured and the way we've been taught stuff. So this is stuff that I blab on about all the time, but just being more, I guess, conscious and thoughtful of the way that you do think about people with disability, and maybe start to question why you think certain ways about disability and people with disability, like our worthiness, what we can contribute, especially when it comes to sex. Stop starting the, Tinder or Grindr fucking message with, can you have sex? Like, if we're on there, especially Grindr, most likely that's what we're looking for. Like,
right.
I'm not going to get on there and be like, oh yeah, no, can't.
Right.
So, like that would be counterproductive. So yeah. Anyway, we'll finish it on that. Thank you so much for coming on again, Carson.
Oh yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Been a pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah. And everyone, obviously check out Carson if you haven't already. And myself, I'm Jason Clymo, so My Life with Wheels and XES Products. So thank you again and goodbye.
Yep. Thanks, Jason. Bye.